Hi, everyone. So I'm going to attempt to canter through online safety in about 10 minutes. So let's see how we go. I'm sure most of you know the Online Safety Act is a landmark piece of legislation that came into force last year. And it essentially creates an entirely new online safety regulatory regime for a previously unregulated sector. It also actually introduces some new criminal offences for perpetrators of harmful content online. It's aimed at significantly improving internet safety, and it's the UK's answer to the EU's Digital Services Act. And we're starting to see more of these kind of acts pop up around the globe as well. The UK government has made some fairly bold claims about the Online Safety Act, saying that it's going to make the UK the safest place to be online in the world. I think we might be a little way off that for some reasons I'll come on to. And there's certainly some critics out there who think that it doesn't go far enough. So we shall see. Some of you in the room might be thinking, hang on a minute, online safety, that's not data protection. This is a data protection conference. And you'd be right, it's not a data protection law. But there is a clear kind of overlap with data protection laws, particularly with certain areas, key things like age assurance, protection of children online, but also a user's privacy is really quite fundamental to keeping them safe online. So you can see where the two regimes overlap. And perhaps not surprisingly, the ICO and Ofcom have released a couple of joint statements about how they plan to work together to the extent that data protection and online safety interact with one another. The most recent of these statements was published just on the 1st of May, and this essentially sets out how they plan to work together to promote compliance across the regimes, to support innovation and kind of remove unnecessary regulatory burdens in terms of sort of sharing information and taking a consistent approach. So that's all really positive. So moving on to who actually needs to comply with this new legislation. Well, there's three categories of online service providers that are covered. The first is user-to-user services. This is pretty broad. It covers your social media, gaming sites, dating sites, video sharing platforms, instant messaging services. So it's got pretty broad coverage. You've then got search services, so that's any service that incorporates a search engine that's capable of searching multiple sites. And then finally, you've got providers of pornography services. So those are the three kind of main areas that are covered. There are some exemptions, but I'm not going to go into those today. So all of these organisations that are covered need to put in place certain measures to protect users from online harms. That's what this Act does. The Act also sets out some kind of subcategories. It's got these three categories that it's for now called 1, 2A and 2B, which will be subject to additional obligations. And we can kind of assume these will be the higher risk organisations. The Secretary of State is going to set the thresholds for these three categories. And it's likely to look at things like what are the functions of these services, are they particularly high risk, but also the sort of volume of users of these services. And ultimately, Ofcom will publish a register of these categorised services so that we'll know which services are covered. And then separately to that, when we're kind of talking about size, Ofcom's also proposed its own categorisation of services on the basis of their size and risk profile, essentially with the intention that very large services, so at the moment Ofcom's proposing that's over 7 million users on average each month, but also what they've called multi-risk services. So these are services that present kind of multiple risks of online harms. Those two categories will be subject to additional obligations under Ofcom's codes of practice. And I'm going to come on to those. But essentially, these codes will set out ways to comply with the Online Safety Act. And so there's going to be more obligations if you're a bigger organisation or you're a multi-risk organisation. And then just in terms of jurisdictional reach, so it is a piece of UK legislation. It obviously applies to services provided out of the UK, but it also applies to services provided from outside the UK. And this is where there are links to the UK. So what that means is the service has a significant number of UK users, it's targeting the UK market, or it could just mean that users in the UK can access that service and there's kind of a material risk that it could cause them significant harm. So it's quite broad in its reach in terms of sort of extraterritorial application. And what does the new Act actually require these services to do? So it places quite a wide range of new obligations on service providers. And the idea is this kind of proactive approach to ensuring the safety of users and kind of preventing harms when people go online. And this is in quite stark contrast to the existing legal regime, which is essentially just providers need to promptly remove illegal content or harmful content once they become aware of it. The Act focuses on two key areas. So one of these is illegal content and the other is content that's harmful to children. The idea behind that is that illegal content should be prevented generally for all users, but then there's this sort of additional protection that's required for children from broader forms of harm that might not be illegal but are still not age appropriate. So that could be things like pornography, content that encouraging things like suicide and self-harm, things like bullying, violence online, so all those kind of things that might be a lot more harmful to children are covered. So the first kind of primary obligation on all of these services is to conduct risk assessments, and these assessments will look at what type of harms could take place on their services, what's the likelihood of those harms occurring, and what's the potential impact of those harms occurring. And then providers will need to sort of assign a risk level based on the outcome of that assessment. Once they've done their assessment, they need to look at measures and mitigations that can put in place to kind of counter those harms. So things like setting age gates for certain content, looking at content moderation, takedown, default settings that can be put in place, governance, accountability. So lots of sort of measures that can be put in place. And the OSA also sets out a number of obligations in the sort of same realm of mitigating risk. So things like making it really easy for users to report content, complaints procedures, obviously things like keeping records, and also a sort of overriding concept of safety by design. And interestingly, it also talks about taking account of kind of fundamental rights like privacy and freedom of expression. So we see a kind of overlap with data protection there. So it covers a lot. I should say as well that none of those obligations are actually in force as yet. You may be aware that Ofcom is in the process of producing a number of consultations on kind of codes of practice and guidance that's going to bring all of these obligations into effect. And they're going to come in on a kind of phased basis over a period of time. And it's quite interesting because the idea of these codes of practice is that they'll actually provide a kind of safe harbour. And that's to say, if organisations comply with what's set out in the code, then they are complying with the Online Safety Act. And I think that's quite interesting because there's this whole regime of doing risk assessments and putting in place measures. But if you're told that simply complying with this code means that you're complying with the Act, then it sort of undermines the importance of these risk assessments and sort of the outcome of those assessments. So it'll be interesting to see how that all works in practice. And just to finish, sorry, I've gone forward a slide. Just to finish, in terms of what's coming next, so Ofcom has published a roadmap of all of these consultations that it intends to publish over the next sort of 18 months. It's already commenced the task of publishing consultations. So towards the end of last year, we had the first major consultation, which was on illegal harms. That one's now closed. Most recently, we've had the consultation on the protection of children, which was published just last week. And I should warn you that these documents are not for the faint-hearted. They are absolutely enormous. I think the illegal harms one is about 1,600 pages long. So if you're thinking about reading them, brace yourself. They are broken down into chunks. But obviously, Ofcom's putting some serious work into these, and it's a really, really important exercise. Among the upcoming consultations that we're expecting to see soon is a much welcome guidance on the protection of women and girls. And this is kind of in recognition of the fact that some of the most harmful online content disproportionately affects this group. So that's really encouraging to see that progress in this area. So I think we'll continue to see kind of consultations going on this year, and then towards the beginning of next year, we might start to see the first obligations actually come into effect. Notably, the criminal offences that I mentioned earlier, those are actually already in force, and there's already been some convictions for criminal offences under the Online Safety Act. So once they come into force, we might start to see some enforcement activity sort of towards the end of next year. Ofcom have got quite broad enforcement powers, everything from kind of information gathering, investigations, but also some really quite significant sanctioning powers. They've got the power to bring in quite extreme business disruption measures, criminal liability for senior management, and of course fines. And interestingly, they've actually got greater fining powers than the ICO, so we could see some really quite significant fines in this area. So I think to finish, it's really kind of watch this space. There's lots more coming. We're going to see lots more codes, lots more guidance. These consultations are going to continue. And over the next few years, we may see some quite significant enforcement. I'm sure some people in this room have got some ideas about who might be the targets for these first enforcement actions. So I guess coming back to what I said at the beginning, online safety, it's not a data protection law, but there is a clear intersection with data protection and the work that we do as data protection practitioners. Of course, we love a bit of compliance, a bit of regulatory enforcement, so we're not going to let a technicality like it's not data protection law get in our way. And with that, I'm going to hand over to Mike, who's going to do our final talk. Thank you.